Happy Wednesday, everybody. In an effort to expand our fantasy tout services, Star Vegas Inc. has decided to add daily fantasy advice to their family of networks. So from here on out, the Daily Star will run every Wednesday to prepare you for your weekend of degenerate gambling. So the first episode will focus on strategy, and future episodes will focus more on players that I like in that week's fantasy lineups and why. So let's talk DFS strategy. For the sake of the Daily Star, we will be addressing DraftKings as the preferred online gaming site for daily fantasy. You can go to FanDuel or Fantasy Aces or Draft Street or any of these other places if you want to. I happen to think that DraftKings has the best user experience and user interface, and I also think that their player evaluations are a little bit better than some of the other sites. So I'll give you a little bit of insight as to what you'll see when you get in there. Basically, most of the games have a $50,000 salary cap, and you have to fit 9 players within that $50,000 salary cap. You have to start a quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, a flex position, which can be running back, wide receiver, or tight end, and a defense special teams. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 of the primary types of games that you can play. There's tons of different little spin-offs, multipliers, and stuff. I'm not going to get into all that. There's 2 games that most people play. The first one is a cash game, and basically a cash game is a heads-up tournament, if you will, where the top 50% of the teams win the cash and the bottom 50% of the teams lose the cash. So you can go heads up against a guy and bet $10. You win his $10 if you win that game and he takes away nothing. Or you can get into a cash game tournament where there's hundreds of teams. As long as you finish in the top 50% of all those teams, you double up your money, and everybody who finishes in the bottom 50% loses their money. It's very straightforward. The other type of game you're going to see in DraftKings is tourneys, or what they refer to as GPPs, which stands for Guaranteed Prize Pools. Basically what that is, it's thousands and thousands of teams. You put in whatever the entry fee is. It can be $2, it can be $2,000, and there's a guaranteed amount of money in the prize pool that will be divvied out. The difference between cash games and tournament games is that tournaments, only the top 30% of teams cash. So it's a little bit tougher to win a tournament game because you have to beat 70% of the field, whereas in a cash game you only have to beat 50. But on the flip side, you can bet a small dollar amount in a tournament, and if you finish in the top 100 teams, your payout can be substantially larger than just doubling up your winnings in a cash game. So that's really the difference in the 2 games. So talk a little bit of strategy on the cash side. Obviously, you want to play a little bit more conservatively because all you're trying to do is beat 50% of the teams. You're not going out on a limb and picking some guy, that's at the bottom of his depth chart hoping that he gets in and breaks a long touchdown run because he's super cheap. You want to spend a little bit more money for guys that have consistent production. The other thing you want to stay away from is stacking too many guys in your lineup from the same game, because if that game happens to turn out to be a defensive struggle, chances are you're probably not going to do that well that week. So stay conservative in a cash game. Play guys that you have faith in, that you think are going to perform moderately well, and you should be okay in cash games. Going over to the tournaments, it's a little bit more picking high-risk, high-reward guys. You're swinging for the fences here, as you've got to put together a really high-performing lineup to get into the top 30% and make a cash. My thought is, you got 9 positions to fill. You can probably draft 6 studs, but there's 3 guys in that lineup that you're going to have to sort of hit a home run with. They're not going to be names that everybody's going to know about. They're going to be guys that are, down on the depth chart. Maybe they're getting in because there's been an injury in front of them, something along those lines. but you've got to take a look at those as possibilities in your GPP lineups. So I play in a $2 GPP tournament at DraftKings. First place is $2,000. I like the return. If I happen to hit it just right, I've spent $2 and I've made $2,000. Last week my two entries paid $5 each. So made money on that, made more money than I would have had I played in a cash game, and I still gave myself the opportunity to be in the running for the grand prize there of $2,000. So talking about some principles in the tournament lineups. So the first principle is stacking, and stacking is basically taking a quarterback and a receiver from the same team that you think have a good chance of hooking up for multiple touchdowns that week. Last week, I started Brady and Gronk in one of my lineups, and obviously that paid off in 7 touchdowns between 2 players. So definitely a good stack there. My other lineup, I stacked Romo and Dez. Was not as much of a good stack. Romo had a decent day. Dez did nothing. I still managed to cash in that lineup because of the rest of the people I put around them. So stacking is definitely a great way to get your lineup off to the right start if you pick the right stack. This week, just to let you know, I like the Matt Ryan, Julio Jones stack based on what they did Monday night against Philadelphia. Obviously, Julio is going to get a ton of targets and some red zone looks. I also like Andrew Luck and Dante Moncrief as a stack in Indianapolis this week, with T.Y. Hilton being out and Andre Johnson drawing most of the Revis coverage there in that game. So just a couple of ideas for some stacking options this week. One of the other things you need to think about in a tournament is player value. And so in a tournament, the rule of thumb is you're looking for a 4% rate of return on investment. So if a player's salary is $7,000, you're looking for him to return 28 fantasy points. Now, we know that, not everybody that's rated at $7,000 is going to return you 28 fantasy points, so that's why you have to look down the list a little bit at some of the cheaper options. Some of the more appealing guys, might be $3,500. Well, then your rate of return is 14 fantasy points against $3,500, and that's much more achievable, especially in a PPR league where it's a point for every reception. You get a point for every 10 yards, both receiving and rushing, and touchdowns are 6 points apiece. So, to get to 14 points, it's basically a touchdown, either rushing or receiving, and maybe 4 touches for 40 yards. Could be catches, could be rushes, and right there you've got your 14 points. So there's plenty of guys out there at the $3,500 mark who can attain that sort of production. As Kuiper would say, these tournaments are all about upside. So we've really got to look at that and focus on player value and upside in our tourney lineups. The other thing that we need to think about here is opportunity. Players that see an increase in their role based on injury, suspension, demotion. Benny Cunningham last week was a prime example. With the 2 running backs in front of him in St. Louis being down for injuries, he could be had for next to nothing. And I think he put up like 18 fantasy points last week. Probably was less than $3,000 in your lineup. So that would have been a really, really good return on your investment. I like Dante Moncrief this week because T.Y. Hilton is down. And as I said before, Andre Johnson's going to draw a lot of Darrelle Revis. So at $4,600, I really like Moncrief's opportunity to get 20-plus fantasy points this week. Draws and fades. No, we're not talking about the golf shot. Talking about players that get hyped in the media are basically players that I like to fade because the general public is going to glom onto that. They're going to say, oh, all the experts are picking this guy, so I'm going to put him in my lineup. The problem with that is if you win, everyone wins along with you. If 40% of the tournament has picked this guy, you're not really separating yourself from the pack. But if you go in a different direction and they lose, then you've really, really, widened the gap there between yourselves and them point-wise. So learn to sort of look at draws and fades, draw on the guys that are flying under the radar, and fade the guys that are popular picks in the media. Over-unders are huge. look at the Vegas lines. I basically like to take any player that has a prominent role that's playing in a game where the over/under is 50 points or more. So basically, you're thinking in that game, Vegas knows which games are going to be shootouts, and they know which ones are going to be defensive struggles. In a 50-point over/under, they're projecting 6 to 7 or more touchdowns to be scored in that game. So your opportunity to have success by picking a player who could be a part of that production is really high. So I definitely look at the over/unders. I try to focus as much as possible on the games that are 50 points or higher and an over/under. Don't be afraid to go with the games that are under that. But if I'm going to take a player in one of those lower over/under games, I want to make sure that that's the player that I'm sure is going to be part of the production. You can't take like a third-string wide receiver in a game where the over/under is 38, because chances are that he's not going to do much for you. So that's sort of the strategy discussion for the tournaments. Just to give you a heads up on some players I like this week. I like Jordan Reed, the tight end from Washington. His value is $3,700 right now. There's no Deshaun Jackson in the lineup, and he was targeted really heavily last week. So I like his opportunity to outscore his 14.8% target number, or his 14.8 points target number at his $3,700 salary. So definitely a tight end option there for you. I like Terrence Williams for obvious reasons. Des Bryant's out. His target should go up as well. He's only $4,200. That's pretty cheap for what, in essence, will turn out to be a number one wide receiver this week. His target point total is 16.8. I'm thinking a touchdown and 5 catches for 50 yards is really all it's going to take to get to 16.8. So that's definitely something we want to look at too. And then lastly, Danny Woodhead, I had him in one of my lineups last week. I think he was $3,700 and he scored 22 points. So he was pretty much 5 or 6 times his value. It's a 50-50 share there with Gordon. Danny's a PPR monster. He's going to get 5 or 6 catches for some yardage, and he also seems to be the red zone back in San Diego. So to outperform a 16-point expectation is definitely something I see him being able to do. So I like Danny Woodhead this week at $4,000. That's all I got for this week. If you guys got any questions, go ahead and post them in the comments. If not, the Daily Star will be back next Wednesday. Happy gambling, degenerates, and let me see you out on DraftKings. Bye-bye.